This is a 2x6, and these are dovetails cut into a 2x6. Now, who's crazy enough to cut dovetails into a 2x6? Well, obviously I am, but you'll be too after you see how easy it is. And the trick is using these jigs in this piece. In this video, we're going to be cutting dovetails for a ladder. Now, this is not the first time that we built a ladder. Our previous ladder using our bigger jig, and it had some issues, mostly that the tread was not actually parallel to the ground. We listened to some of your feedback, and here is what we got as an improvement. Here is the mortise beam. As you can see, the mortises are cut in an angle so that when the tenon comes in, there's your tread at an angle. The tread is 15 degrees, and that's going to be the offset of the actual ladder. So this ladder setup can be used anywhere that you need a ladder, like a loft, playhouse, or bunk bed. I feel much safer knowing that my kid is going to be using a ladder with actual joinery as opposed to screws or nails that can work themselves loose. Setting this up is super easy using these two jigs. I'm going to show you exactly how to set these up and make all these cuts. The first thing that we're going to be working on is going to be the mortises for the rails. So I'm going to be demonstrating on this small piece, but when you do the longer rails, it's going to be the exact same technique. The key thing that we need for this ladder part is going to be this 15-degree piece. It's an index that goes on the mortise of the jig. So on the back, the jig normally comes with this flat piece like that. So these are the pieces for the stairs and ladder bundle. So this one's 15 degrees, 30 degrees, and 45 degrees. As you can see, they go on the back piece of this mortise jig. So you set it up on there. Number 5. For this ladder, we're using a 15-degree one. Works just the same as the flat one, and it goes right into the same holes. So as you can see right there, and then if you're going to do the opposite side, you just take it and flip it around. As you can see, it holds the jig at an angle, and if you flip the index piece, it holds it at an opposite angle like that. Since we did a number 5 for the tenon, I've already tested this before, and it works out pretty well if we set it up on the number 5. You will still have some piece of the tenon that sticks out past the mortise, but coming back with a hand plane or some sort of electric plane, you can get that tenon to be nice and flush with the mortise top. And what I mean by that is when you set up the mortise like this, the tenon sticks out over here. Okay, so how do we actually align this guy up? So we got it that the jig is going to be like this, but we got to be able to position it in the correct place. Well, this jig has a bit of a tick mark down here, right here at the bottom and right at the top, and that's so that you can center it. So what I need to do is draw center lines of where I want these mortises to be. Like I was saying, the spacing between the rungs is typically 10 to 13 inches. And you can look that up online, you can decide whatever number you want. I went with 10 inches between the rungs because this is going to be for my kid, and well, kids have short legs, so 10 inches is pretty good. I'm only going to do one in this case, but if I were to do 2 of them, or rather in the actual piece, I did 10-inch spacing. So now I gotta do the angle. So in this case, just pick one, whether I want it to go in this direction or in the other direction. And I'm using a speed square, so what I would first do is establish the spacing. So I'd measure out over here, so let's say 10 inches. That's gonna be my first rung. And then I would measure out and do 20 inches for the next rung. I want this piece to be angled like that. That means that the foot of this rail also needs to be at an angle like this. This is the opening of the mortise, so this mortise needs to be like this, and this footing needs to be like this. So it's always thinking about it, 5 different ways before you actually do it. To use a speed square, you set up the edge of the speed square right there, then you pivot it, and you're looking at this scale right here for the angle. So you have number 0 to 90. Now I'm going to line up the edge with that number, 15. And that's the angle offset of this bracket that we have on the back there. So all I got to do is strike a line. Okay, so on the opposite rail, we should have a line that looks like that, and the rung should look something like that. I have my rough lines of where those rungs are, and now I can easily go ahead and lay that out. So right here, all the way at the very edge, the opposite one, I have my 15-degree bevel for the foot. So this one is going to be cut with a saw. So this one over here is going to be cut with the jig. So once again, I'm going to measure out 10 inches. So there's my 15-degree line. So there's my mortise. So this is the top. This is the top. Okay. Now when I hold them side by side, those guys should be mirror images of each other. Those lines right there are mirror images of these two rails. Okay, so now we can go ahead and attach our jig. Once again, we're lining it up using that center line and this center line indicator down here. So I'd like to have two drills ready. One to drill a pilot hole, and then the other to drill in the screws. Okay, and that's really all you need. Now you can take off this piece on the back, and now we're going to route this out. Now the technique that I use to route this stuff out is not to ride the jig. So because the bearing is mounted onto the router shaft, it's spinning really fast and gets very, very hot. So remember, this is made out of plastic. If you ride that jig, that bearing is going to get very hot and it's going to melt this jig. For the majority of it, I am trying to stay away from the jig until the very end, where I do ride the jig lightly and I put some pressure on it to be able to get that final profile. But to hog out the material, I just try to stay away from the jig so I don't melt the plastic. One final thing is how I set this guy up. So you can see that over here I got kind of a weird situation going. I got a collar, a bearing, and then another collar. And that's because this is the way that this router bit is shaped. So you can see on this one I only have a collar and a bearing, but then the shaft of the actual router bit kind of gets narrower, and then before it gets to the blade section. And that actually causes a bit of problems. Sometimes this bearing actually falls off and tends to ride inside that lower section. So one of the modifications that we made to this jig was we made it thicker, which allows you to put the bearing in this configuration, which is collar, bearing, collar. Okay, so with the router off, insert it into the hole at the very top and pull it towards here. Now, this router bit is already set to depth. If you didn't have it set to depth, what you would do is make sure that the cutter is completely submerged in the wood, so it's cutting at its maximum depth. Now just take hold and route it out. Try to ride the middle first without riding the actual jig, and then after that, take the final pass and clean everything up. There is some technique to this. You can't just go straight all the way in because it's just gonna dull the blade. What you got to do is kind of do these half moon circles. You got to really work the grain. Now we're ready to take it off. Now the convenient thing about this is that if you do have to come back and rework this mortise, you still have those lines down there that you can absolutely recenter this jig and cut out this exact same mortise. Now this is a pretty extreme example. Normally when this guy blows out like this, it's only about an inch. This guy pulled all the way about almost 3.5 inches down. So you have a couple options here. One is that you can glue all these fibers down. Douglas fir does tend to do this, right? So not so much with something like oak or yellow pine. What I ended up doing actually is I didn't have as much tear out as this, but the parts that I did, I just tore them off and then I filled it in with wood putty. And then these fibers that you have over here, sometimes they tend to get in the way with the tenons, so I like to just shave them off. And that's it. There's your mortise for the ladder. It's at a 15 degree. Now you can go ahead and make your tenons and fit them in there, and they are going to be super tight. For this joint, you can use glue. It's not necessary. This joint is already going to be so crazy tight that you will not have any racking whatsoever. Here's a jig for the tenon. So you can see it has this index piece right here, and it has two orientations. So it has the offset and the non-offset, so meaning that the holes are in line with this flat part or with this section. I'm setting it to number 5 right here, and I'm going to do it with no offset. So now position it onto my 2x6. Now just set it flat. Yeah, set it to number 5 because it's important that this jig is supported down here, right? So that's not flexible now. So now whenever I put my router on here, it'll have a more stable base for it to actually route the 2x6. So I'm going to give myself a couple pilot holes. Now I'm ready to route. I'm going to start from this side over here and route in this direction. Because the router spins like this, once I get to this section over here, it's going to cause a lot of blowout. So I don't start on this section. I actually try to lightly take a couple shavings over here and then finally press it against the jig and take my final pass. You don't need this index piece on here anymore, so you just take it off and put it aside. So I'm going to put it in through this hole over here, and I'm going to hold it up to the wood, and I'm going to make sure by looking at it that that cutter is completely encased in the wood. No more and no less. Okay, and that looks good. Now of course we need to remove this piece over here, so I use a handsaw and I just rest it on that surface that's perfectly cut. And there it is. Now the last step is to reduce the length of this tenon over here, because if we leave this the way it is, then it's going to bottom out on the mortise. So I need to take some shavings off of this face right here. So I just use an electric hand planer and I go from both directions. I go from here about midway and then from the top to about midway. That way I don't get any blowout from the top or the bottom. I'm gonna give it one more pass just to be safe. And that's it, your tenon is ready to be fitted into the mortise. Now of course we need to do the exact same thing to the other side. Just make sure that the orientation of the tenon is in the exact same location. Here I'm using a circular saw to cut the bottom of each rail at an angle. So assembly is pretty straightforward. Line up your two rails next to each other parallel, get your tenons, and you start sliding them in. If you want to use glue, now's the time. These joints are super tight, so if you don't want to use glue, you don't really have to. You may also need a mallet to persuade these in, but they won't bottom out. It's going to be the cheeks that are going to get the tightest, and you'll know when the tenon is fully seated. Okay, so here you can see that the tenon is proud of the mortise, and that's because we were using square stock. So after this is all glued and assembled, we come back and use a hand plane and plane this surface down so it's flush with the railing. Now that the glue is dried, now it's time to take down these extra pieces for the tenon. So I like to use two planes. One is a scrub plane, really aggressive blade over here that's going to take off a majority of the material here, so it won't take very long to get that stock down. And then to clean it up, I'm going to be using a jack plane. Now that I'm close enough, I'm going to switch over to the jack plane. After planing, fill in any gaps with wood filler and let it harden before sanding. And this ladder is going to hook over the railing of the bed, so I cut a bird mouth. Finally, I finished off my ladder with stain to match the bunk bed. Obviously, you can use the finish or stain of your choice. There you have it, folks. This ladder is rock solid and ready to use.